Thank you, Andrea. It is a pleasure and an honor to be here in your beautiful country. And now that I'm actually here, hopefully I'll be able to answer that perplexing question of how you say the name of your country in English. I've called the airline twice. The first time I said I was flying to Qatar, and they corrected me and said Qatar. And the second time, same airline, I said I was flying to Qatar, and they said, no, you're going to Qatar. So hopefully I can settle the issue in English on this trip. I've been asked to talk about some digital developments around the world. And let me take just a moment to tell you a tiny bit of what I do. I'm an old television guy, spent most of my life in and around television, where I was taught that we lost this great opportunity to understand the impact of television. What we should have done and didn't do is should have tracked people before they had television. And I became convinced in the 90s that the impact of digital technology, first the internet and now mobile, was going to be far more powerful than television. So believing that we lost a great opportunity with television and that the impact of digital was going to be even more powerful than television, 10 years ago we launched this World Internet Project, and we tracked the internet in 30 countries around the world. We're in all the places you would expect us to be. In the Middle East, we're in the United Arab Emirates. We're in Iran. We would love to have a partner here in Qatar, and hopefully someone out there hearing this will help us see how we could find a partner here. But let me share very briefly a little bit of what we're seeing worldwide. Starting with 10 years after tracking, some really good news. We're seeing a tremendous diminishing in much of the world of the digital divide. The fear that some people will never have access to this technology. We began to see about 4 years ago in many countries, the United States, the UK, Australia, New Zealand, Japan, South Korea, some parts of the Middle East, we began to see that just about everybody who wanted access to the internet had access. Let me be very careful about that. In those places, not everybody who wanted a PC on their desk at home had one. Not everybody who had broadband had it, but just about everybody in those places who wanted access from some location, not necessarily their preferred location, had it. The digital divide was starting to go away. There's still a serious divide in much of the rest of the world. There's particularly a broadband divide. And let's look at broadband for a minute, because our work showed from the very beginning that broadband changes everything. Almost everybody acquired broadband because of the speed, but it's not really the speed, it's the always-on, the direct connection that changes the entire relationship to the web. I believe there's actually a bigger gap between dial-up and broadband than there is between non-use and dial-up. That's how significant broadband is. Broadband has led in countries with high broadband penetration rates. I wish coming from the United States I could tell you we had one of the highest broadband penetration rates. I actually spoke at a broadband conference in Australia in December where they were complaining that they were number 16th in the world, and I got to speak coming from the country that's number 15 in the world. We have a lot of work to do where broadband's concerned. But broadband really does change just about everything on the web. It's led in the countries where penetration is high. It's become people's most important source of information, surpassing all other media, although I'll show you in a moment how most media, especially television, are moving to the web because of broadband. Broadband also has led people to wanting the internet everywhere in their lives, not just on their desks at home or on their desks in their office, but in their cars, in their pockets, everywhere around them, and how they feel neglected or deficient when they don't have access to the media through an access to the internet through broadband. We're actually seeing around the world the beginning of the understanding of how important broadband is. In Australia, the new Minister of Communication, when he renamed the ministry, he's no longer the Minister of Communication, he's the Minister of Broadband, Communication, and the Digital Economy. And last November, Finland declared access to broadband to be a fundamental right of being a citizen in Finland, something I think we're going to see throughout much of the rest of the world in the coming years. We've seen almost everything move to mobile, and mobile is only growing in importance. Now, I come from a country that's hard to understand that. The United States is a third world country where mobile communication is concerned. I wish that were just a cheap joke, but any of you who have visited America know how bad our mobile communication can be. While the rest of the world is using their mobile phones in subways, leaving the airport in Stockholm, paying for Cokes for machines in Sweden, paying for parking meters even though you're nowhere near your car in Finland. In Tokyo, you can walk out of an office building at lunchtime and your mobile phone will show you all the restaurants in a 2-block radius that have tables available. And in London, your mobile phone will show you all the public restrooms in the immediate vicinity, a very handy feature I can attest to. We in America can barely get our mobile phones to work above ground for voice communication. But we're the exception. As you well know, mobile is now in the hands of over 4.6 billion people out of 6.5 people on the Earth's surface. It's growing rapidly. It will pass 5 billion people. We believe in countries like India, where internet penetration is at 10, 11, 12%, depending on how you count it. As the rest of India goes online, it's not going to be with PCs on the desk. It's going to be through mobile phones. We're already seeing mobile phones and PCs begin to converge. Netbooks were nothing more than a gap between PCs and the mobile phone, and the new Apple iTablet looks exactly like a converged device. Actually, one of my friends who has an iPhone actually refers to the iPad, which is not out yet, but actually refers to it, actually refers to his iPhone as a mini iPad. Beyond mobile, we're seeing extraordinary changes in media around the world because of digital communication. Newspapers. We know that 30 years ago, teenagers didn't read newspapers, but started to when they got into their 20s and 30s. Today, teenagers don't read newspapers, and the evidence is clear they never will. A lot of people look at that and say, well, teenagers just aren't interested in the news. All they care about is what's happening on Facebook or MySpace or Bebo or places like that. Nothing could be further from the truth. Our work shows teenagers around the world more interested in news than any teenage generation in the last 70 years. They've figured out that what happens halfway around the world can change their lives. They're just not going to the newspaper to get that information. They're going online. In every country in the world we are in, and I said we're in 30 countries, in every country in the world we are in, when internet penetration gets to 30%, offline newspaper sales begin to decline. So back to India for a moment, where it's 10, 11, 12%, printed newspaper sales skyrocketing. But we think when it gets to 30%, it will begin to decline there as well. The sad truth for printed newspapers is every time a newspaper reader dies, they're not being replaced by a new reader. This is true in Sweden, the heaviest newspaper reading society on the face of the earth. It's true in the UK, one of the heaviest. It's true in Japan. It's happening everywhere. Internet penetration gets to 30%. We expect to see newspapers move onto the web. There still are questions of how they will be paid for, a battle Rupert Murdoch is in the midst of right now. He doesn't like the idea of people getting all the content from his newspapers online for free. And if anybody could wage that battle effectively, it will be Murdoch. Television, on the other hand, instead of shrinking or changing, we think television is going to grow in importance, explode with growth, escape from the home, and become our constant companion. Our work shows people will watch television on small screens in their pockets and purses, not just 30 or 60-second clips, but they'll also watch hour shows, sometimes straight through if they're stuck at the airport waiting for a flight. Sometimes they'll watch those hour shows in 10 or 12 parts. Keep in mind that at the same time as we're putting these little screens in our pockets and purses, we're putting bigger and better screens in our homes than we've ever had before. The gap between the home and the theater has never been so narrow. The time gap has never been so short. And television, as it moves into all these other places, for the first time escapes from the home. Many of us have always allowed television to dominate our at-home awake time. Many of us turn the television set on the moment we enter the home, leave it on till we go to sleep. Some of us go to sleep with it on. Some of us even leave it on when we're not at home so that people think we are at home. But it was confined to the hours we were at home. Television now is going to move to when we're sitting at the airport waiting for a flight, on the airplane itself, on the back seat of our cars, hopefully not the front seat while we're driving. In America, we saw that in 1975, the average person spent 16 hours a week in front of a screen. Last year, those 16 hours had grown to 34 hours. The difference was 1975, it was one screen in the home on a schedule. Last year, it was 3 or more screens. More importantly, we think those 34 hours will grow to over 50 hours in the next 3 years, and we don't think it's necessarily going to stop there. What's replacing or changing or transforming so much of this traditional media is user-generated content, something we never even thought about 15 years ago when we were talking about the rise of the internet. In 1995, we certainly could see that personal communication through email was going to transform our lives. We could also anticipate commerce, buying things online, was going to change our lives. But we never could have anticipated that all of us would become newspaper publishers, television producers, and the like. But the internet has done nothing short of reversing 550 years of media trends that began with Gutenberg and his Bible in Germany in the 15th century. Up until the internet, all mass communication was from the few to the many. And the many had very few and poor ways of communicating back. A letter to the editor, a phone call to the broadcast station. Now, through the internet, communication is from the many to the few and the many to the many. And we're seeing extraordinary changes. If you talk to teenagers around the world today, to paraphrase Andy Warhol, they couldn't care less about 15 minutes of fame. What teenagers around the world care about is 15 megabytes of fame. Because 15 minutes of fame is gone in 15 minutes. 15 megabytes lasts forever. And just to wrap this up, the most important, compelling part of user-generated content that we've seen in the last 5 of our 10 years comes from social networking, which we really believe is the real deal. The first thing that's caused people to log onto the web more than to check their email. Some people say social networking is nothing more than a trend or a fad. We think which social network a teenager is in is a trend or a fad. We watched years ago as Friendster made way for MySpace, which is making way today for Facebook. We understand that where a teen is a fad. To a teenager, a social networking is like a nightclub. And when the nightclub becomes too popular or the uncool kids start showing up at the nightclub, you're out of there. As a teenager, what's the worst thing that could happen to you in a nightclub? Running into your mother. Well, today, on Facebook, your mother wants to friend you. How long will you stay in a place where your mother is? Not that you don't like your mother, but you don't want to socialize with your mother. Which community a teen is in will constantly change, but keep in mind, worldwide, we're seeing the heaviest users of social networks are people in their 60s and 70s, and people who derive the most value. They're just in different networks. They're in networks learning how to be a better chess player, how to deal with the physical or emotional toll of cancer, where they want to talk about religion or politics. And I'll finish by saying, in the top 10 countries of the world, as far as number of people who are members of social networking sites, we found that of people in those 10 countries, of those who are members of online communities, we found in 2008, 43% said that their online communities were as important to them as their offline communities, or almost half saying their online lives were as important as their offline lives. In 2009, that number went up to 55%. I don't believe it can actually get bigger. I actually think there may be a backlash and it may reverse, but this is already something changing the fundamental ways in which we interact globally. It's been a pleasure to talk this morning. I will get a few more minutes later this afternoon to update a little bit of what I've talked about, but thank you again for having me here.